human beings examine and look at the important issues that we face in life, it's important to have reasons why we believe the things we do. This is no different when we look at the existence of God or his characteristics. Now, when asked, why don't you believe in God? A popular answer is there is simply no evidence to believe in God. However, as William Lane Craig often says, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, what logically follows from, quote, not having enough evidence is not absolute knowledge, but rather uncertainty. For example, we don't have any evidence that there's oil on Pluto. However, our lack of evidence on the matter does not lead us to conclude that there is no oil on Pluto, but rather that we just don't know if there is or not. Thus, a knowledge claim against the existence of God requires a reason to be justified. One may try to state a counter-argument to this and say, well, we should just start believing in things like the flying spaghetti monster, or trolls, or Santa Claus. However, the reason why we don't believe in these things is not because we have no evidence for them, but rather because we have evidence against their existence. We have been to the North Pole and not found any workshops or elves running about. A ball of omniscient spaghetti is a priori unintentable. Thus, we don't believe in myths because there's good reason not to believe in them, not because we don't have evidence about them. So to reiterate, there needs to be a reason why one believes the way he does, and this includes the belief that God does not exist. And there are genuinely many atheists who do give good reasons to why they don't believe God exists. One such reason is the problem of evil, and this will be the central theme to the following few videos that I'll be making. Now, the problem of evil can take several different formulations, and each needs to be handled a little differently. For example, the logical problem of evil needs to be answered differently than the emotional problem of evil. You don't use logical reasoning at first glance with someone who's struggling with the death of a son, or something to that effect. It would come across as cruel and dry. That's not to negate the use of logic, it's just a caution, if you will. Yet we need to note two important things to determine if the question of evil even makes sense before we begin discussing the problem of evil. This is what I would like to do in this first video. First, it is not only the theist who needs to give an answer to this question, that being the problem of evil, but every worldview needs to answer the problem of evil. For example, why does evil exist in the atheistic worldview? Why do we not simply label some events the result of nature, the strongest of the fittest, via natural selection? What's the distinction here? I'm aware of Christianity's answer to the question of the problem of evil. Indeed, the Bible does not shy away from explaining evil. I would be curious to hear the atheistic answer to the problem of evil, as I would assume we all agree that it is a disturbing phenomenon, that being evil. Thus, there are three sides to the problem of evil that every worldview needs to answer, namely the metaphysical problem, what is the source of the evil, the physical problem, how do events fit into this discussion, and the moral problem, how can these events be justified? Second, the problem of evil implicitly raises another issue, and that is ethics. Now, you can be a relativist, you can be an objectivist when it comes to ethics. If one is a relativist, then I would suggest that you can't logically use the problem of evil as a reason to disbelieve in God's existence. Here's why. According to relativism, the concept of evil would be nothing more than a personal preference. Thus, what you call evil is not necessarily evil. In other words, to say something is evil is to say that it should not be this way. This implies an absolute and an ought. Yet this is what relativism denies, so what exactly is the problem when we speak about the problem of evil with a relativist? There isn't one. It's not the problem of evil, but it's the problem with relativism. Now, if one is an objectivist when it comes to ethics, then they can logically use the problem of evil. It makes more sense. However, implicit in objective morals is a moral law. So to borrow from Ravi Zacharias, when you assert there is such a thing as evil, you're asserting that there is such a thing as good. When you assert that there's such a thing as good, you are asserting a moral law by which to differentiate between evil and good. When you assume there is such a thing as a moral law, you must assume that there is such a thing as a moral lawgiver. Yet the moral lawgiver is precisely what some people are trying to disprove with the problem of evil. Do you see the problem here? We have two notions. We have the first notion, the problem of evil, based on the second notion of objective morals rooted in a moral lawgiver. Yet the first notion is trying to undercut the second notion of objective morals in a moral lawgiver and say that he doesn't exist. So in a sense, this objection is circular. It's self-refuting, more accurately I would say, self-refuting. So it's basically nonsensical in a logical sense. Now you may object and say, why do we need a moral lawgiver to have objective morals? And I think that's a good objection, but basically the reason why I think this is true is a moral affirmation cannot remain an abstraction. What do I mean by that? I mean that as human beings we have intrinsic transcending worth. But this transcending intrinsic worth in us can only come from a craftsman or a person. That's the only way it logically makes sense to me. If we are based in a world with a naturalistic worldview where only matter exists and the law is natural selection, survival of the fittest reigns, how can we say that we have transcending intrinsic worth? It just logically does not make sense to me. Thus, if my logic and those I've cited is sound, then the question of evil is internally nonsensical, and it's not evidence against God, but evidence for God, because it points to objective morality, and this basically becomes the moral argument for the existence of God. However, this is not to say that the emotional component of this problem of evil is nonsensical. What I'm saying is nonsensical is the logical version of the argument, or the evidence version of the argument. I think the emotional version of the argument is very powerful and needs to be answered very delicately. Let's quickly go over the main points of this introductory video before I begin giving a rationale in defense of Christian theism in the light of the existence of evil. The first main point we need to consider is reasons should always be given as to why we believe the way we do. The second main point is appealing to a lack of evidence is not a good reason and a justifiable reason to not believe in God's existence. Number 3, the problem of evil needs to be answered by every single worldview, not just Christian theism. And number 4, the logical problem of evil seems to be self-refuting. That's not to say that the emotional problem is, it's just to say that 3 out of the 4 ways the problem of evil is raised seems to self-destruct. Now let's quickly look at the 4 ways that the objector can raise the problem of evil and then answer each of these. The first way is the problem of evil poses a logical inconsistency in the character of God, the objector will say. The second way the problem of evil can be raised is that God's existence is not probable in the light of the amount of suffering and evil in the world. The third way, the problem of evil is good evidence against the existence of God. And the fourth way is the emotional problem of evil.